Sports cars are supposed to be sleek, fast, and desirable, but sometimes automakers went completely off the rails. Weird shapes, strange engineering, and baffling decisions gave the world some of the most bizarre cars ever to wear the sports badge. They were bold, they were different, but most of the time, they just didn't make any sense at all. Here are the 13 most bizarre sports cars that made no sense. Stick around till the end and don't forget to subscribe.
The Bricklin SV1, built in Canada from 1974 to 1976, is one of those cars that looks like a dream on paper, but turns into a nightmare the second you actually try to live with it. Conceived by American businessman Malcolm Bricklin as a safety sports car, the SV1 was supposed to be Canada's Corvette killer, a bold entry into the high-performance market with futuristic gull-wing doors, plastic body panels, and a sleek, wedge-shaped profile that turned heads wherever it went. On showroom floors, it seemed like a revolution. Here was a car with the visual drama of a European exotic, the practicality of American components, and a mission statement that tied speed to safety. But once the gloss wore off, the reality was so full of compromises, failures, and laughable oversights that the Bricklin quickly became a punchline. Instead of a Corvette rival, it became one of the most notorious automotive flops of the decade. The gull-wing doors, easily the car's most distinctive feature, also became its most infamous flaw. They looked spectacular, giving the SV1 an exotic, futuristic flair that rivaled Mercedes' legendary 300 SL. Unfortunately, the execution was disastrous. Instead of being counterbalanced or spring-loaded, the doors were hydraulically operated, and the hydraulic systems were woefully underbuilt. They frequently leaked, lost pressure, or outright failed, which meant the heavy doors would get stuck in the closed position. Owners were literally trapped inside their cars, sometimes having to crawl out through the hatch or wait for a mechanic to free them. Stories of people being stranded in their driveways, at gas stations, or worse, in parking garages became legendary. A safety car that could imprison you was, understandably, a hard sell. Weight was another Achilles heel. For all its dramatic styling, the SV1 tipped the scales at around 3,500 pounds, making it far heavier than its Corvette rival. The plastic body panels were bonded to a steel frame that was over-engineered in pursuit of crash protection, and the gull-wing door mechanism added further bulk. The result was a sports car that wasn't very sporty at all. Early cars used AMC-sourced 360 cubic inch V8s, later swapped for Ford's 351 Windsor, but emission strangulation and sheer mass meant performance was sluggish. 0 to 60 times were in the 10-second range, and quarter-mile passes hovered in the mid-17s, figures that embarrassed the SV1 next to actual sports cars of its era. Road testers mocked it as a car that looks like it's going 150 miles per hour standing still, but struggles to outrun a family sedan. Quality control was abysmal, largely because the Bricklin project was rushed into production with minimal testing and constant cost-cutting. Fit and finish were atrocious. Panel gaps varied wildly, paint quality was inconsistent, and electrical systems were unreliable. Interiors, while futuristic in concept, were cramped and cheaply executed, with hard plastics and poorly fitted trim that rattled and squeaked from day one. Assembly workers in New Brunswick lacked proper training, and the car's complex design only made matters worse. Owners quickly realized that their expensive, futuristic sports car felt more like a kit car slapped together in someone's garage. The safety angle, which was supposed to differentiate the Bricklin, added to the car's oddness. Instead of chrome bumpers, the SV1 used color-molded plastic that flexed on impact, a novel idea but one that aged poorly. Its massive bumpers and thick roof pillars, designed to protect passengers, limited visibility and made the car feel claustrophobic. The cockpit was cramped, with little headroom under the gull wings, and ventilation was poor, leading to unbearably hot interiors in summer. The irony of a safety sports car that overheated, broke down, and could lock you inside wasn't lost on its critics. Fuel economy was predictably dreadful, often hovering around 10 to 12 mpg, making the SV1 expensive to run during the fuel crisis era. Parts availability was spotty, especially as the company struggled financially, and dealerships were unprepared for the volume of repairs these cars demanded. Mechanics loathed working on them, especially when it came to the door hydraulics or electrical gremlins, and owners often found themselves stranded while waiting weeks for replacement parts that might never come. Public perception of the SV1 shifted quickly from awe to ridicule. At first, it drew crowds and admiration. People genuinely thought it looked like the future. But as horror stories spread about failures, trapped drivers, and underwhelming performance, its reputation tanked. Journalists coined mocking nicknames. Instead of Safety Vehicle 1, they called it Stranded Vehicle 1 or Slow Vehicle 1. By the time production collapsed in 1976, fewer than 3,000 had been built, and the Canadian government, which had pumped millions into the project, was left embarrassed by the fiasco. Yet, in fairness, the Bricklin wasn't entirely without merit. Its bold design really did stand out, and its concept of blending exotic styling with safety was ahead of its time in some ways. Had it been better engineered, more carefully developed, and less rushed into production, it might have carved out a niche as a quirky American-Canadian sports car. Instead, it remains a cautionary tale about ambition outpacing reality, a futuristic dream car undone by poor execution. Today, surviving SV1s are collector oddities, admired for their looks, but cursed for their flaws. Enthusiasts who own them either embrace the challenge or spend endless time fixing doors, chasing parts, and explaining to curious strangers why their gull-wing sports car is sitting immobile at a gas station. It's remembered less as Canada's Corvette and more as a symbol of how even the boldest ideas can crumble under the weight of sloppy engineering and poor planning. Would you like me to make an even longer version with period magazine reviews, direct owner horror stories, and comparisons with both the Corvette and the DeLorean, so it becomes a near epic portrait of how the Bricklin SV1 turned from bold dream into infamous disaster?
The Aston Martin Lagonda, built between 1976 and 1990, is one of the strangest luxury cars ever unleashed on the public. A machine that looked like it had been teleported from some parallel future and dropped onto the motorways of the late 1970s. With its impossibly long, low, wedge-shaped body, its bizarre proportions, and a dashboard filled with glowing digital instruments and touch-sensitive controls, the Lagonda was intended to be nothing less than a rolling spaceship for the wealthy elite. It was Aston Martin's gamble to merge the old-world hand-built luxury of its marquee with cutting-edge computer technology and futuristic styling. In theory, this combination of opulence and innovation should have made the Lagonda the most advanced luxury sedan of its era. In reality, it became infamous as one of the most unreliable, impractical, and frustrating cars ever built. A car that could leave its millionaire owners stranded on the side of the road while its computers blinked themselves into oblivion. The styling alone ensured that the Lagonda stood apart from every other luxury sedan of its day. Designed by William Townes, the car was unapologetically angular, long, flat, and knife-edged, more like a futuristic concept car than anything meant for actual road use. Measuring over 17 feet in length, yet standing barely above the ground, it looked like a spaceship mated with a luxury barge. Its sheer presence guaranteed attention, and in the late 1970s, that was precisely the point. Aston wanted to shock, to redefine what a luxury saloon could be. Customers expecting the graceful curves of a DB6 or the understated elegance of a Bentley were instead greeted with something that looked like Darth Vader's personal limousine. Inside, things only got stranger. Aston Martin went all in on the future, stuffing the Lagonda with a digital dashboard controlled by computers at a time when the average family car still relied on analog gauges and simple toggle switches. Early models featured glowing LED readouts in place of traditional dials, along with capacitive touch controls for everything from lights to climate systems.
Later versions experimented with cathode ray tube displays, turning the dashboard into something that looked like it had been stolen from a Cold War command center. Owners at first were dazzled. Sitting behind the wheel of a Lagonda was like stepping into the cockpit of a sci-fi starship. But awe quickly turned to horror because the electronics almost never worked properly. The digital instruments were so fragile and temperamental that they failed constantly, often going dark without warning. Touch-sensitive buttons refused to respond. Climate controls operated at random, and warning lights flashed for no reason. Some cars were so plagued with glitches that dealers stripped out the digital dashboards entirely and replaced them with more conventional analog gauges just to make the cars usable. Owners paid Rolls-Royce money only to find themselves stranded because their futuristic Aston refused to recognize its own ignition input. Journalists of the day marveled at the car's boldness but mocked its execution, with one British magazine describing it as a magnificent folly, like a stately home fitted with disco lights. Mechanically, the Lagonda didn't redeem itself either. It was powered by Aston Martin's 5.3-liter DOHC V8, an engine that in other models was capable of great things. In the Lagonda, however, saddled with emissions controls, extra weight, and the complexity of its electronics, performance was underwhelming. Acceleration was sluggish for such an expensive car, with 0 to 60 miles per hour times in the 8 to 9 second range, and its handling was ponderous. At over 2 tons, with vague steering and suspension tuned for comfort over control, the Lagonda drove like the massive barge it was. Owners often complained that while it looked like a futuristic super saloon, it handled more like a cumbersome limousine. Reliability was a constant thorn in Aston's side. Beyond the digital systems, the Lagonda's wiring looms, electrical connections, and control units were fragile and poorly built. Heat, vibration, and age only exacerbated their problems. Getting a Lagonda serviced was a nightmare, since few mechanics understood its arcane systems, and parts were rare even when the car was new. Aston Martin, being a small company with limited resources, had no way to fully debug the complex electronics, and as a result, every Lagonda that left the factory was effectively a ticking time bomb. Stories circulated of wealthy Middle Eastern owners who kept 3 or 4 Lagondas on hand at once, so that when one broke down, which was inevitable, they could rotate into another. Even aside from its reliability disasters, the Lagonda was a difficult car to live with. Its interior was cramped despite its massive size, thanks to the low roofline and odd packaging. Visibility was poor, luggage space was limited, and ergonomics were bizarre. Fuel economy was predictably atrocious, with single-digit MPG not uncommon, especially in city driving. Combined with constant breakdowns, astronomical servicing bills, and frustrating daily usability, the Lagonda became infamous as a car that nobody bought twice. Yet for all its faults, the Lagonda holds a peculiar charm today. It was undeniably decades ahead of its time in its ambition. Digital dashboards, touch controls, and spaceship-inspired styling would later become mainstream. But Aston tried to force them into existence long before the technology was ready. The result was a luxury sedan that looked like nothing else on the road. A bold statement of design and intent that was utterly impractical in reality. Collectors today view the Lagonda as a piece of art more than a functional automobile, a testament to Aston Martin's audacity in building something so radically futuristic, even if it never really worked. In hindsight, the Aston Martin Lagonda has become both a cautionary tale and a cult classic. For many, it represents the dangers of chasing the future too quickly, without the resources or technology to back it up. For others, it's a glorious reminder of an era when car companies dared to be truly outrageous, consequences damned. Owners who brave them today do so knowing full well that they'll spend more time fixing dashboards than driving, but they also know that nothing else commands the same mix of fascination, ridicule, and admiration. The Lagonda wasn't just a car. It was a four-wheeled science experiment that escaped the lab.
The Matra Simca Bagheera, produced between 1973 and 1980, is one of those cars that proves the French could never be accused of lacking imagination, but sometimes imagination came at the expense of practicality. At first glance, the Bagheera looked like a proper European sports car. Sleek, wedge-shaped styling, low stance, and exotic details that made it resemble a junior Ferrari or Lamborghini. Buyers could be forgiven for thinking they were getting a Gallic rival to the Italian greats, something to shock the establishment. But then they opened the door, and the car revealed its party trick. Instead of the usual two-seat sports car layout, the Bagheera had 3 seats across the front row, like an aircraft cockpit or a bench on wheels. The driver sat on the left with 2 passengers side by side, creating a unique but cramped arrangement that became both the car's most famous feature and its most awkward. The idea came from Matra's aerospace background. Matra was primarily known for making missiles and aircraft components, and when it branched into cars, it tried to bring in that same flair for unusual solutions. With Simca as a partner, they believed the 3-abreast setup would give the Bagheera a selling point in an increasingly competitive sports car market. In brochures, the layout was advertised as sociable, perfect for couples with a child or for 3 young friends hitting the road together. In reality, it meant squeezing 3 adults into a narrow cockpit, knees touching, elbows clashing, and personal space evaporating after the first 5 minutes of driving. What sounded futuristic on paper often turned into comedy in practice. Then there was the engine, or rather, the lack of one. Despite its sharp styling, the Bagheera was powered by a small 1.3-liter or 1.4-liter 4-cylinder taken straight from the Simca 1100 family car. These engines were workmanlike at best, but hopelessly inadequate for a car that looked like it should be chasing Ferraris down the Riviera. With just 82 horsepower on tap in the early versions, the Bagheera's performance was modest, managing 0 to 60 miles per hour in around 12 to 13 seconds, which made it slower than many family sedans of the era. Later models crept up to 90 horsepower, but by then, rivals were offering far more excitement. Owners who bought the car for its looks quickly discovered it was all bark and no bite. A sports car that looked exotic but performed like a commuter hatchback. Handling was decent, as the mid-engine layout gave it balance and agility. But without real power, it was like watching a ballerina trying to sprint in concrete shoes. Worse still, reliability was poor even by French standards. The engines were serviceable but uninspiring, and the real Achilles heel was the bodywork. The Bagheera used fiberglass reinforced plastic panels mounted on a steel frame, and while the plastic resisted dents, the steel beneath it rusted catastrophically. Because the rust often spread invisibly under the body panels, Bagheeras could look fine on the outside while dissolving from within. Owners reported discovering horror show levels of corrosion after only a few years, sometimes with frames so weakened that the cars became structurally unsafe long before they looked worn. The Bagheera's reputation for rust was so bad that even in France, where people tolerated quirks, the car became known as a disposable exotic. Many were simply scrapped when the rot set in, and survivors today are exceedingly rare. It's estimated that the vast majority of the 47,000 built are long gone, victims of poor rust-proofing and neglect. Even when they were new, mechanics dreaded working on them because of odd packaging and flimsy components. Despite all this, the Bagheera has earned a strange cult following. Its daring styling, unusual seating layout, and sheer audacity make it a fascinating piece of automotive history. To some enthusiasts, it represents the kind of bold experimentation that car makers no longer dare attempt.
To others, it's a cautionary tale of what happens when looks are prioritized over substance. One former owner summed it up best in an old motoring forum. It was a car that promised me a French Ferrari and delivered me a rusty Simca with a third seat I never wanted. Today, the Bagheera is remembered less for its performance and more for its eccentricity. Collectors who manage to find a rust-free example treasure them as oddball curiosities, museum pieces of 1970s French ambition. For everyone else, the Bagheera stands as proof that sometimes a clever idea and daring design aren't enough to make a great car, especially when the steel underneath is turning to dust faster than the car can get to 60 miles per hour. The Marcos Mantis XP of 1968 is one of those rare, almost mythical machines in automotive history that seem to exist outside of time. It wasn't just a car, it was a statement. One part earnest engineering experiment, one part bizarre science fiction dream made metal. It was supposed to launch a tiny British builder, Marcos, onto the global endurance racing stage, maybe even into the hallowed grounds of Le Mans. Instead, it became a one-off curiosity, remembered more for its surreal looks than for anything it did on track. And yet, precisely because of that strangeness, it has never been forgotten. Marcos was not Ferrari, not Porsche, not even Lola. Founded by Jem Marsh and Frank Costin, the company was always an underdog. Costin's background in aeronautical engineering meant Marcos cars often carried unusual, aerodynamically obsessed shapes. He thought like a man who had spent years sketching airplanes, not automobiles, and the Mantis XP was perhaps the purest expression of that philosophy. When it was unveiled in 1968, people genuinely did not know what to make of it. In a decade when car design was rapidly shifting from flowing 1950s curves to the hard wedges that would dominate the 1970s, the Mantis XP didn't belong to either school. It looked like something alien. Its swollen arches bulged outward like the thighs of some insect about to leap. The canopy-style cockpit bubbled up as if lifted from a fighter jet, while the whole stance seemed hunkered down, tense, ready to spring, yet awkward, almost frog-like. Period journalists laughed and sneered. Some called it grotesque, others mesmerizing. One contemporary writer compared it to a frog in mid-leap that someone had forgotten to finish sculpting. It was not conventionally beautiful, but it was unforgettable. Beneath that strange fiberglass skin lurked a serious heart, a Ford 289-302-based small-block V8, the same family of engines that powered the GT40 to victory at Le Mans and gave Shelby Cobras their thunder. Marcos had real ambitions. They wanted to prove that with clever aerodynamics and light weight, they could run with the giants. But as soon as the car hit the track, reality set in. The aerodynamic profile, so carefully shaped by Costin, created unexpected handling quirks. At high speeds, the car was nervous, twitchy, sometimes outright frightening. Stability was the cornerstone of endurance racing, and the Mantis XP lacked it in spades. Drivers reported that it was nearly impossible to push to its limits with confidence. So, the Mantis XP never saw Le Mans glory. It turned laps, it appeared in minor events, it teased what might have been, and then it quietly faded. Marcos, a company with limited resources, could not afford to keep refining an experiment that wasn't delivering results. By the early 1970s, the car was already being trotted out more as a showpiece than a competitive racer, a symbol of ambition rather than achievement. And yet, its legend grew. People couldn't forget the way it looked. At shows and exhibitions, surrounded by Countachs, Ferraris, or Lolas, the Mantis XP looked like something from a parallel dimension. Where others had sharp wedges or elegant curves, the Mantis seemed swollen, insectoid, grotesquely organic. Even standing still, it looked like it had crawled onto the show floor from some other planet. Some enthusiasts adored it for exactly that reason. Others considered it a punchline. But either way, they remembered it.
In retrospect, the Mantis XP feels like the automotive equivalent of a wild prototype fighter jet that never went into production. It was too radical, too far from convention, and too flawed to succeed in the practical world of racing. But as an idea, as a vision, it was magnificent. It represented the spirit of a time when even the smallest companies dared to dream of taking on giants, when one-off experiments were still allowed to hit the track, and when designers had the courage to let imagination override caution. Today, the lone surviving Mantis XP is treasured by collectors not for what it achieved, but for what it attempted. It is rolled out occasionally at historic events, and every time it does, people react the same way they did in 1968. Some laugh, some stare in awe, but nobody shrugs and walks away. That is the enduring power of the Mantis XP. One journalist, reflecting years later, summed it up best. The Mantis XP looked like a racing car described by someone who had never seen one, then drawn by a science fiction illustrator after a long night in the pub. That's not a compliment in the traditional sense, but it captures exactly why the car endures. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't successful, but it was bold, memorable, and utterly unique. And in the strange world of automotive history, that sometimes matters more than victory.
The Dome Zero of 1978 is one of those rare automotive ghosts, a car that burned bright in the public's imagination, left a trail of speculation and admiration, but ultimately never reached the open road. In many ways, it was Japan's first real attempt at building a world-class supercar, an audacious shot across the bow of Ferrari and Lamborghini from a nation that, up to that point, was still mostly known in the West for reliable compacts and quirky sports cars like the Datsun 240Z. The Dome Zero wasn't just another concept car wheeled onto a stage under bright lights. It was a fully functional, drivable prototype that seemed to arrive from the future. Its sharp wedge profile, low-slung stance, and fighter jet-like canopy made it look like it had leapt straight out of a sci-fi comic book or a futuristic video game. To this day, it remains one of the most striking Japanese designs ever put on wheels. Dome, a small company founded by racing engineer Minoru Hayashi, was no stranger to ambitious dreams. They had experience in motorsport, and Hayashi himself was obsessed with building Japan's first true supercar, a machine that could stand on the global stage alongside the Italians, and show that Japanese ingenuity could create something both exotic and functional. The result was the Zero, a machine barely 38 inches tall at the roofline, with a pointed nose, hidden headlights, and scissor-like doors that added to the futuristic drama. To casual observers in 1978, it looked more radical than a Lamborghini Countach, more alien than anything Ferrari had at the time. But beneath the radical fiberglass skin lurked the disappointment. The Zero was powered not by a thundering V12 or a fire-breathing turbocharged monster, but a modest Nissan L28 inline-six, the same engine found in the Datsun 280Z. That meant about 145 to 160 horsepower in prototype form. With the car's extremely lightweight, performance wasn't terrible, but it wasn't enough to match the aggressive looks. Reviewers who got the chance to drive it said it felt nimble and exotic, but lacked the kind of ferocious acceleration buyers expected from something that looked like a spaceship. In a way, the Dome Zero was like a video game rendered in real life, dazzling on the screen, but limited when you picked up the controller. The real killer, however, wasn't the engine. It was regulation. Dome had ambitions to sell the car in the United States, which was the largest supercar market at the time, but the late 1970s were a nightmare for anyone trying to clear federal safety and emissions standards. For a tiny outfit like Dome, passing crash testing, emissions requirements, and federal certification was financially impossible. The Japanese domestic market, meanwhile, was too small and conservative to support such an outlandish machine. By 1979, Dome had shifted its focus back towards racing, and the Zero project was quietly shelved. Only a handful of prototypes were ever built. And yet, the Dome Zero never really disappeared. Its wild design made it an instant pop culture icon. It was featured in posters, magazines, and perhaps most famously, in video games and toy car lines like Hot Wheels. For many kids in the 1980s and 1990s, the Dome Zero wasn't an obscure Japanese prototype, it was that cool wedge-shaped car you raced in your favorite game, the one that looked faster than anything else. It became a legend not because of what it did on the road, but because of what it looked like. Today, the few surviving domes live in museums and private collections, occasionally wheeled out for exhibitions where they still draw crowds. Enthusiasts who see one in person often describe the same experience, disbelief that something so radical existed in 1978, and frustration that it never got the chance to shine as a real production car. The Dome Zero represents a tantalizing what-if in automotive history. What if Japan had launched a proper supercar a decade before the Honda NSX? What if Dome had found a partner to help it overcome US regulations? What if this bizarre wedge-shaped wonder had made it to the streets of Los Angeles or Tokyo? In the end, the Dome Zero was less a failure and more a dream that never had the chance to grow. It was a glimpse of what Japan was capable of long before the rest of the world was ready to accept it. Like so many prototypes, it was killed by money, politics, and bureaucracy, not by imagination. And that's why, decades later, it still feels like it belongs not in history books, but in the world of fantasy, the kind of car you might expect to find roaring down neon-lit highways in an anime or blasting across the screen in a video game. Do you want me to expand this even further into a long feature-length profile, adding comparisons to other wedge supercars of the 70s, like the Countach, Vector V2, and even Japanese rivals like the Toyota 2000 GT, while weaving in the cultural impact of the Dome Zero's video game immortality? The Reliant Scimitar GTE, produced from 1968 to 1975, occupies one of the most peculiar corners of 1970s automotive history. A car that was audacious in concept, divisive in execution, and unforgettable in appearance. It wasn't just another British sports car, and it wasn't just another station wagon. It was a hybrid of two wildly different philosophies, the thrill of a sports coupe married to the practicality of a utility vehicle, a marriage that, in the hands of Reliant, produced something strange, heavy, and almost cartoonishly unbalanced. Yet, for those who were willing to overlook its flaws, it offered a glimpse of what could have been a revolutionary idea in car design, a high-performance estate that could handle both the racetrack and the grocery run. Reliant had a long tradition of building lightweight, oddball vehicles, from the infamous three-wheeled Regal to various small vans, but the Scimitar GTE represented a serious attempt to enter the luxury sports market with a twist. The body, crafted in fiberglass over a steel backbone, gave the car a striking silhouette, a long, sloping fastback roofline that swept back into a practical hatch, a sharply angled nose, and muscular fenders that hinted at speed while simultaneously suggesting mass. With the 3.0-liter Ford SX V6 under the bonnet, the Scimitar could reach highway speeds with authority, though acceleration was never razor-sharp. Its engine delivered torque in a smooth, linear fashion, but the car's relatively heavy chassis and soft suspension meant that it never quite had the poise or precision expected of a proper sports car. Reviewers at the time described it as wallowy and ponderous, while enthusiasts grumbled that it felt like a compromise between two competing ideas, never excelling fully at either. Yet, despite its handling quirks, the GTE had undeniable charm. It was spacious for a sports car, offering enough room to carry luggage, pets, or weekend gear, something that no traditional two-seater could match. The interior was reasonably comfortable, with sport seats up front and a hatchback that opened to a surprisingly large cargo area. The car's looks, while unconventional, were undeniably distinctive. In an era dominated by MB-GTs, Triumph GT6s, and Ford Capris, the Scimitar GTE stood out immediately, its fiberglass body gleaming in the sunlight, the long fastback roofline tapering toward the rear with the elegance of a coupe but the utility of a small estate. Perhaps the most unusual aspect of the Scimitar GTE's story is its connection to the British royal family. Princess Anne, known for her active lifestyle and keen interest in driving, famously owned a GTE and was often photographed at the wheel. While her ownership gave the car a touch of glamour and a whiff of aristocratic credibility, it did little to disguise its oddities. To the public, the sight of a royal driving such an unconventional vehicle added to the car's mystique. It became a symbol of eccentric British engineering, not entirely practical, not particularly fast, yet impossible to ignore. Period journalists seized on this royal association, often juxtaposing the car's quirks with Princess Anne's elegance, creating a surreal image of a sports estate piloted by a princess who seemed to understand and embrace its contradictions. Mechanically, the Scimitar GTE was both robust and flawed. The Essex V6 was smooth and generally reliable, but its weight, combined with the long, heavy body, meant the car's dynamics were compromised. The suspension was tuned more for comfort than agility, leading to body roll and vague steering at speed. Enthusiasts who tried to push it hard discovered that while the car could cruise beautifully, it did not reward spirited driving with precision or confidence. Long-term owners, however, appreciated its relative mechanical simplicity, the robustness of the Ford drivetrain, and the forgiving nature of the chassis. For everyday use, it was surprisingly practical, especially in an era when few cars combined cargo space with any hint of sportiness. The Scimitar GTE's reputation today is a curious mix of affection and bemusement. On the one hand, it was a pioneer, an early example of what would become the shooting brake segment, paving the way for later high-performance estates like the Volvo 850 T5 and the Audi RS2 Avant. On the other hand, it was undeniably weird, heavy, awkward, and sometimes difficult to drive. Enthusiasts describe it as a car that made you grin despite itself, a vehicle that was rewarding because it was unusual rather than because it was perfect. Collector clubs often celebrate it for its daring combination of sport and practicality, while road tests from the 1970s are frequently cited as evidence of British eccentricity at its peak. One journalist wrote, "The Scimitar GTE is the car that could take the family to the countryside, the dog to the park, and still make you feel like you're driving something truly special, if you ignore the handling." The Lamborghini Urraco, produced from 1973 to 1979, is one of the strangest chapters in Lamborghini's history. A car that promised Italian exotica at a supposedly affordable price, but delivered a confusing, often frustrating experience. In the early 1970s, Lamborghini was riding high on the success of the Miura, the car that had redefined what a supercar could be. But the Miura was expensive, ultra-exclusive, and limited to a tiny handful of buyers. The Urraco was conceived as a solution, a smaller, supposedly more accessible mid-engine sports car that could broaden Lamborghini's market without diluting the brand's exotic cachet. On paper, it sounded brilliant. In practice, it was an awkward, underwhelming compromise that alienated both enthusiasts and casual buyers. The car was powered by a transversely mounted V8, available in 3 displacements, 2.0, 2.5, and 3.0 liters, depending on the market. Unlike the screaming V12s that defined Lamborghini's reputation, the Urraco's V8 offered modest horsepower and, while respectable for a mid-70s Italian sports car, was nowhere near the kind of blistering performance customers expected from the Raging Bull badge. Top-end models struggled to produce excitement comparable to contemporaries like the Ferrari Dino 308 GT4 or even Maserati's Merak. The result was a car that looked sharp, wedge-shaped, low-slung, and unmistakably Italian, but felt underpowered, especially given its mid-engine layout and exotic styling cues. Driving it was reportedly more about managing its quirks than reveling in raw speed. Owners' accounts of the Urraco reveal a car that was often more stressed than fun. Reliability was a nightmare. Electrical issues, overheating, and complex suspension problems were common, and service costs could rapidly surpass the car's original price. Unlike the Miura or Countach, which at least had the thrill of legendary performance to justify headaches, The Arauco demanded attention for problems that didn't offer commensurate excitement in return. Many owners of the day admitted that the car's handling was odd, sometimes twitchy at high speeds, other times ponderous in corners, making spirited driving a test of patience. The interior, while stylish, was cramped, and some of the design choices, like oddly positioned controls and limited visibility, added to the sense that this was a car designed by engineers more than by drivers. Aesthetically, the Arauco sits in an awkward space. It wasn't ugly, far from it, but its proportions and angular lines were peculiar compared to Lamborghini's other offerings. The wedge-shaped profile was cutting edge for 1973, yet the rear overhangs, taillight configuration, and side intakes created an appearance that some critics found awkward. Combined with the low-power V8, it looked like a Miura in spirit, but a scaled-down version in both stature and attitude, a compromise that was immediately noticeable, and in the eyes of many, unwelcome. Lamborghini had high hopes for the Arauco, particularly in export markets like the United States, where enthusiasts wanted exotic looks without paying Miura money. But the timing could not have been worse. The 1973 oil crisis and tightening emission standards further complicated matters, limiting sales potential and creating headaches for owners. By the end of its production run, in 1979, just over 700 units had been built, a tiny fraction of what Lamborghini had hoped. Those that survive today are remembered as oddities in the brand's otherwise stellar lineup, prized more for their rarity and historical curiosity than for their performance or usability. Collectors and enthusiasts today often describe the Arauco as a Lamborghini that never should have existed. It represents the brand's attempt to democratize exotic sports cars, but in doing so, it stumbled into a strange and awkward territory. Too exotic to be ordinary, too unreliable to be enjoyable, and too compromised to fully satisfy purists. It's a car that fascinates not because it was perfect, but because it dared to exist at all, challenging the conventional notion of what a Lamborghini could or should be. One former owner summarized it perfectly. Owning an Arauco was like having a wild, temperamental pet. It looked amazing, everyone admired it, but it demanded constant attention. You loved it, but you never truly relaxed around it. Today, the Arauco stands as a cautionary tale in Lamborghini history, a car of bold ambition and beautiful design, undone by concept flaws, reliability nightmares, and the cruel realities of its time.
The Monteverdi High 450 of 1970 is one of the strangest and most extravagant footnotes in automotive history, a car that looked like it had escaped from a supercar fantasy and then immediately refused to behave like a normal vehicle. Monteverdi, the small Swiss boutique manufacturer founded by Peter Monteverdi, was known for ambitious, low-production exotics, and the High 450 was the ultimate expression of that vision, a hyper-limited, ultra-powerful sports car that existed more as an exercise in engineering bravado than as a practical automobile. Only a handful were ever made. Some sources suggest fewer than 5, making it rarer than most Italian exotics of the era and cementing its status as a bizarre collector's dream. At the heart of the High 450 was a fearsome Chrysler Hemi V8, producing an astronomical 450 horsepower, which, in 1970, placed the car in the upper echelon of raw American muscle transplanted into a European exotic. Monteverdi's intent was clear: fuse Swiss precision, European design, and brute force American power into a road-going rocket that could compete with Ferrari, Lamborghini, and Maserati. The chassis and suspension were custom-built, the body sleek, low, and aggressive, with sharp edges that hinted at speed even while stationary. On paper, it was a fantasy made real, a supercar in the purest sense, audacious, uncompromising, and utterly exclusive. But the reality of driving a High 450 was something else entirely. The car was notoriously difficult to handle. The Hemi V8 produced massive torque, but the chassis and suspension, though advanced for the era, were inadequate to taming that power.
Steering was heavy and imprecise, brakes struggled to match the engine's output, and the low-slung body, combined with rudimentary cooling systems, led to overheating on even modest drives. Period journalists who managed to sample the car described it as an object of terror and delight in equal measure. Every journey required nerves of steel, careful attention to temperature gauges, and a willingness to accept that even minor traffic could turn into a logistical challenge. Inside the car, the cockpit was hot, cramped, and stuffed with gauges, switches, and knobs that seemed designed more for a test pilot than a driver. The air conditioning, if it existed at all, was useless against the heat radiating from the Hemi, making summer driving nearly unbearable. Visibility was limited, ingress and egress were awkward, and comfort was a distant thought. This was a car designed to intimidate, impress, and dominate, not to ferry passengers to dinner in comfort. The Monteverdi High 450 was also absurdly impractical. Its low profile and aggressive stance made it ill-suited for real-world roads, and maintenance was a nightmare. Parts were bespoke, expensive, and virtually impossible to source outside of Switzerland. Even basic repairs demanded a skilled hand, and every outing risked overheating or other mechanical failure. While the car could, in theory, hit insane speeds and accelerate like a dragster, achieving those moments on public roads was perilous at best, bordering on suicidal. Many owners reportedly kept the car in climate-controlled garages, pulling it out only for special events, photo shoots, or short exhibitions, more as an object art than a true road car. Yet, despite, or perhaps because of its absurdity, the High 450 has earned cult status. It represents a type of automotive ambition that no modern manufacturer could realistically pursue. A hand-built, low-volume hypercar where raw power, exotic styling, and unbridled vision trumped safety, practicality, or drivability. It was a car that lived on the edge, daring anyone brave enough to drive it, and cementing Monteverdi's reputation as a boutique maker willing to push boundaries far beyond reason. Collectors today treasure the High 450 for its rarity, audacity, and sheer "what the hell were they thinking" energy. It's a car that could simultaneously terrify, thrill, and fascinate anyone who encounters it. One former owner once remarked, "It's less a car and more a mechanical beast in a fiberglass shell. You feel alive simply by sitting in it, even if you never dare to push it to full power." That sentiment captures the essence of the High 450, a car that makes perfect sense only as a dream, a legend, and a piece of automotive theater. Utterly ridiculous, completely impractical, and unforgettable. If you want, I can expand this into an even longer magazine-style retrospective, including comparisons to contemporaries like the Iso Grifo, De Tomasto Mangusta, and Pantera, plus more anecdotes from the few surviving owners and Monteverdi historians to make it read like a full-feature article.
The Citroën SM, produced from 1970 to 1975, is one of the most fascinating and confounding cars of the 1970s. A vehicle that combined French avant-garde engineering, Italian high-performance ambition, and a level of complexity that often left owners frustrated, bewildered, and occasionally broke. At the time, Citroën was already renowned for its daring innovations, hydro-pneumatic suspension, power-assisted everything, and styling that defied convention. With the SM, the French automaker decided to take its boldest ideas and merge them with Maserati's expertise, creating a grand touring sports car that was equal parts spaceship, luxury GT, and mechanical enigma. The story of the SM began with Citroën's acquisition of Maserati in the late 1960s. Citroën wanted a flagship that could rival Ferrari, Jaguar, and Mercedes in both style and performance, but still retain the comfort, sophistication, and technological wizardry of French design. Maserati provided the 2.7 and later 3.0-liter V6 engines, tuned to produce roughly 170 to 180 horsepower, modest by Italian supercar standards, but impressive for a front-wheel drive GT. The SM's performance on paper was respectable, 0 to 60 miles per hour in under 8 seconds, and a top speed exceeding 140 miles per hour, enough to hold its own in European Grand Touring circles. Yet these figures only tell half the story. The experience of driving an SM was like piloting a craft from another planet. Front-wheel drive,
paired with an extremely long wheelbase and hydro-pneumatic suspension, gave the SM an almost magical ride quality. The car could float over bumps with uncanny smoothness, corners felt planted in a way few contemporaries could match, and the variable assist steering allowed the car to respond to driver inputs with eerie precision at speed. But the very technology that made the SM sublime also made it fiendishly complicated. Every system, brakes, steering, suspension, even the headlights, relied on hydraulic pressure, meaning a single leak or failure could incapacitate the car. Owners quickly learned that servicing an SM required specialist knowledge, access to rare parts, and nerves of steel. Many found themselves sending cars back to France for repairs or becoming part of an informal network of dedicated mechanics and fellow enthusiasts to keep the vehicle on the road. Stylistically, the SM was a showstopper. Designed by Robert Opron, the body was sleek, low, and tapered to the rear, with a long hood and sharply angled windshield. Its distinctive covered headlights, which swiveled with steering input, and the fastback profile gave it a futuristic, almost aerodynamic look that was unlike anything else on the road. It was a car that drew attention wherever it went. Passers-by would stare, photographers would snap pictures, and journalists described it as a spaceship on wheels. Yet the exotic design also contributed to practical frustrations. Visibility was sometimes limited, ingress and egress could be awkward, and the long nose made city driving a constant exercise in precision. The Maserati engine, while potent, added another layer of complexity. It was finicky, prone to overheating, and demanded meticulous maintenance. Parts were expensive, and the combination of Italian engineering inside a French hydro-pneumatic chassis created a situation where reliability could be a lottery. Many SM owners described the car as beautiful, thrilling, and almost hypnotic to drive, yet terrifying in its potential for sudden, costly failure. Enthusiasts often joked that owning an SM required not just money, but time, patience, and a willingness to embrace chaos. The SM's fate in the market was a mixture of admiration and tragedy. Its timing coincided with the 1973 oil crisis, which made thirsty Grand Touring cars less appealing, and the complexity and cost of maintenance limited broader adoption. Production ceased in 1975 after fewer than 13,000 units were built, a small number by Citroën standards, ensuring its place as a rare and coveted collector car today. Despite the challenges, the SM has retained a loyal following among enthusiasts who revel in its combination of technology, style, and audacity. It is remembered not just as a car, but as a statement, a French GT that dared to be different in every possible way, merging the sophistication of Citroën with the flair of Maserati, even if the result was sometimes fragile and frustrating. Driving the SM was an experience unlike any other. Acceleration, though moderate by modern standards, felt urgent and linear. Corners were taken with confidence due to the magic of hydro-pneumatic suspension, and the interior, wrapped in leather and wood, enveloped the driver in luxury. Yet behind that elegance lurked constant maintenance worries. Hydraulic leaks, temperamental carburetors, and electrical quirks ensured that owning an SM was not for the faint of heart. For some, it was a car to be treasured, admired, and carefully nursed. For others, it was an exquisite headache, a masterpiece that demanded devotion. In the end, the Citroën SM is remembered as one of the most audacious cars of the 1970s, a front-wheel drive Grand Touring that combined French ingenuity, Italian heart, and futuristic design. It was gorgeous, innovative, and entirely impractical. The kind of car that rewarded love and patience, but punished neglect. It remains a symbol of an era when automotive ambition could be as bold as it was fragile. A car that continues to inspire awe, admiration, and occasional exasperation decades later. If you like, I can expand this further into an even longer, full retrospective including anecdotes from period road tests, detailed technical breakdowns of the hydraulics, comparisons with Ferrari 365 GT 2+2, Maserati Ghibli, and the Jaguar XJ12, as well as stories from enthusiasts who wrestled with the SM's mechanical quirks to keep it alive.
The Ferrari 365 GT4 Berlinetta Boxer, produced between 1973 and 1976, is one of those rare cars in Ferrari history that perfectly captures the brand's genius and its occasional disregard for practicality. Introduced as the successor to the legendary 365 Daytona, the BB, short for Berlinetta Boxer, marked a radical departure from Ferrari's front-engine V12 formula. Instead, it placed a flat 12 engine behind the driver in a mid-engine layout, a revolutionary step for the company at the time. On paper, it promised blistering performance, an exotic profile, and a driving experience unlike any Ferrari before. In reality, it was a car of contradictions: breathtakingly fast, outrageously styled, and yet borderline impractical for any real-world use. The heart of the BB was its 4.4-liter flat 12, producing around 380 horsepower in European trim. The mid-engine layout dramatically improved handling, giving the car a balance and agility that no Daytona could touch. Drivers who experienced it on twisty roads often described a surreal sensation. The car felt glued to the tarmac, yet the raw power of the flat 12 made every throttle input a potential adrenaline rush. Acceleration was ferocious, top-end speed exceeded 170 miles per hour, and the engine note, a high-pitched wail punctuated by the flat plane crank's growl, was unforgettable. Yet despite this awe-inspiring performance, the car had critical flaws that made it difficult to live with outside of spirited drives or the occasional road test. Cooling was the BB's Achilles heel. Ferrari engineers struggled to manage the heat generated by the mid-mounted flat 12, and during the summer months, engines frequently ran dangerously hot. Some early owners reported warped cylinder heads, blown gaskets, or overheating in traffic, turning what should have been a joyful experience into a tense, nerve-wracking exercise. Servicing the car was also complicated. Access to the engine required removing panels, and many components were packed tightly into the engine bay, making even routine maintenance a labor-intensive affair. These issues earned the car a reputation as a temperamental Italian exotic, thrilling to drive, but not something you could leave parked at home without anxiety. Styling-wise, the BB was unmistakably Ferrari, yet radically different. Pininfarina gave it a sharp, angular wedge shape, low nose, pop-up headlights, and a wide rear haunch that immediately communicated speed even at a standstill. Unlike the Daytona, which looked elegant and somewhat restrained, the BB shouted modern supercar from every angle. Its flat, low-slung profile made ingress and egress a challenge, especially for Tola drivers, and the cabin was snug, focusing entirely on driver engagement rather than comfort. Period journalists praised the aggressive, purposeful design, but noted that it was less refined for long journeys than previous Ferraris. The car's exclusivity and audacity made it polarizing among Ferrari purists. Some embraced the mid-engine layout as the future of Ferrari performance, while others lamented the loss of front-engine elegance that had defined the marque. Daily usability was minimal. Traffic lights, city streets, and narrow parking spaces became trials rather than conveniences. Yet those who could tame it found an extraordinary balance between speed, control, and emotion. The raw thrill of a true Italian supercar, with the bravery required to pilot it responsibly. Despite its impracticality, the 365 GT4 BB laid the groundwork for the legendary Ferrari Berlinetta Boxer lineage, eventually evolving into the 512 BB and 512 BBi, and cementing Ferrari's embrace of mid-engine V12 Grand Tours. Its flaws, overheating, cramped cabin, and challenging maintenance, became part of its legend, a testament to a company willing to prioritize performance and innovation over practicality. The car is remembered today as a daring engineering exercise, a bridge between classic front-engine GTs and modern mid-engine supercars, and a reminder that Ferrari has never been content with merely safe or sensible cars.
Owners and enthusiasts often describe the BB with a mixture of awe and trepidation. One early tester wrote, "It's like strapping yourself to a rocket with wheels. Exhilarating, terrifying, and completely addictive. But don't think you'll ever have a relaxed lunch in this car without worrying if it's about to boil over." That sums up the essence of the BB, a car that demanded respect, courage, and attention, rewarding those who could handle it with some of the purest driving thrills of the 1970s. If you want, I can expand this into an even longer feature-length retrospective, including period road tests, detailed technical breakdowns of the Flat 12's quirks, comparisons with the Daytona and contemporary supercars like the Lamborghini Huracan, Maserati Bora, and De Tomaso Pantera, plus anecdotes from owners navigating traffic, long trips, and the car's infamous temperamental behavior.
The Stutz Blackhawk, produced from 1971 through 1987, occupies one of the strangest niches in automotive history. A car that combined outrageous styling, massive American V8 power, and the aura of ultra-luxury into something utterly unlike anything else on the road. To call it a sports car is almost a joke. The Blackhawk had the stance of a grand coupe, the weight of a small limousine, and the visual bravado of a Hollywood prop. Yet, for those who could afford it, this odd combination of excess and performance became an object of desire, a rolling symbol of status and flamboyance rather than a driver's car in any conventional sense. The Blackhawk was built by the Stutz Motor Car Company in the United States, a company better known for its 1920s luxury models. Designer Virgil Exner, famed for his work with Chrysler, brought his signature exaggeration to the project. The car's styling was extreme. Enormous chrome grills dominated the front fascia, oversized bumpers jutted like ornaments, and the long hood flowed into a massive cabin with squared-off rear quarters. Pop-up or hidden headlights were optional in some series, but the car's sheer width and vertical front end made it impossible to ignore. Even in a sea of 1970s luxury coupes, the Blackhawk screamed, "Look at me," making it an ideal celebrity magnet. Indeed, stars like Elvis Presley, Sammy Davis Jr., and John Wayne were among its most famous owners, drawn to the combination of exclusivity, flamboyance, and straight-up spectacle. Underneath its showy exterior was a brutally simple American formula. A massive front-mounted V8, usually sourced from General Motors, Ford, or Chrysler, depending on the year and customer preference. These engines ranged from 350 to 500 cubic inches, providing plenty of power to move the Blackhawk's hefty body. Performance was respectable for a car of its size, with smooth, torquey acceleration that rewarded straight-line drives, but did little to mitigate the Blackhawk's enormous weight and high center of gravity in corners. Steering was heavy, suspension soft, and handling vague, making the car less of a sports coupe and more of a luxury missile. Fast enough to impress, but cumbersome enough to keep drivers humble. The interior amplified the contradiction between sportiness and opulence. Plush leather, thick carpeting, walnut trim, and a dashboard full of chrome accents evoked the feeling of a private jet more than a car designed for the road. Every comfort was included: automatic climate control, power windows, and massive seats. But the ergonomics often seemed secondary to the goal of impressing anyone who stepped inside. The cabin was long, wide, and luxurious, making it comfortable for extended drives. Yet the car's enormous proportions and limited maneuverability meant city driving could be a slow, cumbersome ordeal. The Blackhawk's appeal, therefore, was not about driving purity or engineering sophistication. It was about image. Owning one was a statement of wealth, taste, and daring. To the outside world, it looked like a bizarre attempt to turn a sports car into a limousine, a car that was as heavy as a barge, yet dressed like an exotic coupe. To those who could afford it, the Blackhawk offered exclusivity, boldness, and the thrill of driving a car no one else on the planet could match. It was essentially a Hollywood creation, extreme, theatrical, and utterly unapologetic. Despite being largely impractical, enormous, hard to park, thirsty for fuel, and impossible to handle at speed, the Blackhawk's production continued for a decade in small numbers. Each one was hand-built and often customized for its celebrity owner, further cementing its aura as an ultra-exclusive object of desire. Unlike other 1970s luxury cars, which tried to blend comfort, performance, and styling in a balanced way, the Stutz Blackhawk embraced imbalance and absurdity, turning its quirks into defining features. Today, the Blackhawk is a collector's oddity, valued less for performance or engineering brilliance and more for its story, its glamour, and its sheer audacity. It is a car that embodies the contradictions of 1970s American excess, simultaneously luxurious, overpowered, stylish, and impractical. Former owners often recalled the experience with a mix of nostalgia and amusement. It felt like driving a castle on wheels. You never handled it like a sports car, you just glided, basking in the attention it drew. The Blackhawk remains an unforgettable testament to an era when automotive imagination knew almost no limits. A car that was beautiful, bizarre, and entirely unapologetic in its indulgence. The ISO Lele, produced between 1969 and 1974, is one of the most curious, perplexing, and underappreciated entries in the annals of Italian automotive history. When ISO set out to build the Lele, their goal was audacious: combine Italian styling flair, American reliability, and the usability of a four-seat Grand Tourer. They had previously achieved acclaim and some commercial success with the ISO Grifo and the Fidia, cars that paired exotic Italian design with robust Chevrolet or Ford V8 engines. The Lele, however, would end up straddling too many identities at once, leaving it awkward, misunderstood, and commercially underwhelming. It was a car caught between worlds, trying to be both family-friendly and a pure-blooded GT, but ultimately failing to fully satisfy either goal. Its production numbers were exceedingly low, with estimates ranging around 200-300 units total, making it incredibly rare and little known today, even among serious collectors of 1970s Italian exotics. From the very first glance, the Lele is visually perplexing. Designed by the legendary Bertoni studio under the hand of Giorgetto Giugiaro, the car attempted a blend of elegance and aggression. The long angular hood promised performance, but the roofline was tall, and the rear deck seemed disproportionately large relative to the front, creating a somewhat clumsy, stretched silhouette. The lines were sharp, but lacked the cohesive flow seen in contemporaries like the Maserati Ghibli or ISO Grifo. The car's proportions often leave the impression that ISO was trying to merge a stylish coupe with a practical sedan, and the result was neither fully elegant nor truly sporty, a compromise that left critics puzzled. Many period reviewers remarked that the Lele cannot decide if it wants to be serious or flamboyant, while others dubbed it the awkward Italian-American GT. Yet this awkwardness also lent it a kind of unique charm. It is immediately recognizable and undeniably exotic, and in a sea of more conventional Grand Tours, it stands out even decades later. Mechanically, the Lele followed the ISO formula, a large American V8 nestled in the front, with choices typically from Chevrolet or Ford, ranging from 4.7 to 5.7 liters, delivering 300 to 325 horsepower. On paper, this was sufficient to provide lively acceleration and grand touring capability. In practice, however, the car's handling revealed the compromises of its design. The chassis was sturdy, but not perfectly tuned for the American engine's torque, making high-speed cornering a tentative exercise rather than a confident thrill. The weight distribution, combined with relatively soft suspension for comfort, meant that the car could cruise effortlessly on highways, but it lacked the razor-sharp dynamics expected from an exotic GT. Steering was heavy at low speeds, vague at high speeds, and braking performance was adequate but unremarkable. The car had the power to impress in a straight line, but it never gave the driver the fully satisfying connected feel that a Maserati or Ferrari of the era could provide. Interior-wise, The Lele aimed to be luxurious, but here too, the car was caught between extremes. ISO attempted to offer a 4-seat GT, but rear seating was tight, more suitable for occasional passengers or luggage than actual comfort. Front seats were more accommodating, upholstered in leather with a generous amount of wood trim and chrome accents, giving the interior a classic Italian feel. The dash was simple, yet elegant, with a row of gauges and switches that emphasized functionality over flamboyance. Yet the car's interior ergonomics were slightly compromised by the ambitious attempt to combine practicality with exotic styling. Ingress and egress were awkward. Cabin space was unevenly distributed, and the driver often felt perched rather than settled. Despite these imperfections, the Lele's interior carried a certain charm, an unmistakable aura of rarity and exclusivity that few contemporaries could match. The ISO Lele's commercial reception reflected its awkward compromises. It could not compete with the sharper, more cohesive Maserati Indy or Ferrari 365 GT 2+2 in terms of driving dynamics, nor could it match the comfort or prestige of larger Italian GTs. ISO's small-scale production and limited dealer network further hindered its reach, and most people simply never encountered one. In the United States and Europe, it quickly faded into obscurity, overshadowed by more glamorous or more dynamic competitors. Ironically, it is precisely this obscurity that has elevated its status among modern collectors. Today, finding a well-preserved Lele is extremely difficult, making it a true cult classic, a car that is largely unknown to the general public, yet revered by aficionados who appreciate its rarity, uniqueness, and the daring ambition behind its creation. Beyond rarity, the Lele's identity crisis also manifests in its personality on the road. Owners who have driven the car recount a mix of exhilaration and frustration. The V8 engine delivers satisfying American torque, producing an unmistakable growl and effortless highway acceleration. Yet the steering, suspension, and chassis do not fully translate that power into confidence during spirited driving. One enthusiast remarked, "It feels like it wants to be a Ferrari, but it keeps reminding you that it's really a Chevrolet V8 wearing Italian clothes." The car is charming, quirky, and simultaneously imposing, offering the thrill of an exotic GT while never fully committing to the role. Its rarity is another facet of the Lele's allure. It represents an era when boutique Italian automakers dared to experiment with blending American muscle and European design, a daring concept that was not always executed successfully but remains endlessly fascinating. The Lele stands as a testament to ISO's ambition and willingness to push boundaries, even if the end result was flawed. Unlike mass-produced cars, the Lele was bespoke in many ways. Buyers could request custom trim, engine choices, and interior configurations, ensuring that each example had unique quirks and personality. In today's collector market, the ISO Lele is treasured precisely because of its contradictions. It is awkward, rare, powerful, and strange. A car that embodies an identity crisis yet carries undeniable charm. Driving one is an experience that demands attention, patience, and appreciation for nuance. The V8's roar, the slightly imprecise steering, the exotic styling that defies convention, all of it combines to create something unforgettable. One modern owner reflected, "Owning a Lele is like having a secret. People often ask what it is, and when you explain, their eyes widen. It's a car that lives in its own little world, and that's why it's special." In the end, the ISO Lele is more than just an oddball GT. It is a window into a unique moment in automotive history. A car built for ambition, creativity, and audacity, even if those goals led to a product that was awkward, rare, and commercially unsuccessful. Its rarity, quirks, and peculiar combination of Italian design and American muscle have made it a cult classic,
admired by enthusiasts who appreciate not just speed or beauty, but character, story, and the courage to attempt something so unusual. It remains one of the strangest and most fascinating Italian-American Grand Tourers ever built. A car that, more than 45 years later, continues to intrigue, puzzle, and delight those lucky enough to encounter it.
The Siva S530, a 1970s kit car, is a perfect example of the era's weird obsession with blending radical futuristic styling with pedestrian mechanical underpinnings. At first glance, it looks like something plucked directly from a science fiction comic or a low-budget space opera. Sharp, angular fiberglass panels, low-slung proportions, and gull wing-inspired doors that seem to promise speed and performance. The Siva S530 was the kind of car that made you stop, stare, and wonder if it had somehow escaped from a movie set rather than a British garage. For designers in the kit car boom of the 1970s, creating something visually outrageous was the primary goal, and Siva succeeded spectacularly. Underneath that futuristic spaceship shell, however, the reality was far less thrilling. The S530 used a Volkswagen Beetle floor pan, complete with its humble, air-cooled flat-4 engine. That meant that despite its aggressive alien appearance, the car's acceleration and handling were firmly in vintage compact sedan territory. Enthusiasts often described it as a spaceship that trudged like a tractor. The promised exoticism of a supercar never materialized in performance. Instead, drivers were treated to a slow, soft-sprung ride that was more reminiscent of a Beetle's gentle cruising than a sports car's agility. Steering was light, brakes modest, and the car's low stance and wide body occasionally amplified body roll, making the fantasy of racing exotic corners feel laughably unattainable. The kit car culture of the 1970s was filled with ambitious but impractical creations, and the Siva S530 exemplifies the extremes of that trend. Builders were drawn to the allure of owning a car that looked impossibly exotic, that could turn heads wherever it went. For a few £100, an amateur mechanic could assemble the kit in a garage, slap on a Beetle engine, and suddenly own something that looked like a Lamborghini or a futuristic concept car, if you ignored the fact that it couldn't accelerate past many mundane sedanins. Siva marketed the car aggressively to hobbyists, emphasizing the ability to create an exotic, one-of-a-kind machine while using readily available and cheap mechanical parts. In practice, however, the end result often looked outlandishly impressive while performing underwhelmingly. Perhaps the strangest part of the S530's legacy is how seriously people took it at the time. It appeared in magazine spreads, attended kit car shows, and was featured as a must-have exotic for the discerning DIY enthusiast. Yet beneath all the fiberglass drama was a mechanical reality that could never live up to the promises of its appearance. Owners frequently reported frustration with the combination of lightweight bodywork over a weak engine, noting that high-speed stability was unpredictable and that long drives were tiring due to the lack of refinement in both suspension and drivetrain. Some recalled the car as a badge of pride, while others admitted that it was essentially a theatrical prop, something to be admired visually rather than driven aggressively. The Siva S530 also exemplifies a particular British eccentricity in automotive culture, the desire to make something extraordinary out of modest means. While the big Italian and German manufacturers were building high-cost supercars, small British firms and kit car makers like Siva were offering the fantasy of speed and exotic design to anyone willing to spend a little money and a lot of time in a garage. The result was a car that looked stunning, perhaps even threatening, on the driveway, but delivered only the gentle pace of a Volkswagen Beetle on the road. And yet, the juxtaposition is part of the car's charm.
The ridiculous contrast between the dramatic exterior and pedestrian mechanicals makes the Siva S530 a quintessential 1970s kit car, outrageous, ambitious, and slightly ridiculous. Today, surviving Siva S530s are exceedingly rare. Enthusiasts treasure them not for speed or refinement, but for their audacity, their unapologetic strangeness, and their ability to make even the most mundane car enthusiast pause in disbelief. Driving one is less about performance and more about the experience of having created or owned something that defied conventional logic. A car that looks like a spaceship, but reminds you that you're firmly grounded in the reality of 1970s kit car engineering. One former owner summed it up perfectly. It looks like it should warp through the stars, but you spend most of your time wondering why your Beetle engine isn't doing more. If you want, I can expand this further into a longer, feature-length profile, weaving in period kit car culture, comparisons with other bizarre fiberglass specials like the Nova, the Scorpion, or the Panther Westwinds, and anecdotes from owners struggling with its clunky handling and alien aesthetics.